Announcement. There we go. So hello, everyone. Welcome again to the October meeting. I'm Melanie Blake and here with Tim Mulligan. I'm going to introduce him in just one moment and tell you a little bit about our talk. We're going to pay a virtual visit of sorts to the National Archives, where, as you might have seen in the meeting announcement, and as Tim will talk about, there are thousands of rolls of microfilm of Imperial German Navy records. And Tim's going to talk about what we can learn from these records about specific events during World War I, and also their potential to broaden or perhaps even change current interpretations of events during the war. And again, our speaker is Tim Mulligan, a native of Baltimore. He got his PhD in diplomatic history from the University of Maryland. And he's retired after 34 years as an employee and more than 10 years, I believe, as a volunteer at the National Archives and Records Administration, the author of 3 books, many articles. And Tim, I don't know, I think I might not be alone here. I love details, and I'm sure that you're a details person, and many of the people here are details people. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about these records and what they can tell us about World War I.
Okay, thank you, Melanie.
Without further ado, Tim Mulligan.
Thank you. And if you could, please hold your questions to the end. Pardon me if I'm reading this, but that's the only way I can get through the 45-minute limit by focusing on specific comments. So good morning to all of you on the West Coast. Good afternoon to everyone else on the East Coast here in the Midwest. As I say, I think you'll find today's talk a little bit different from previous talks. First of all, we're talking about the Imperial German Navy. And secondly, we're going to focus on the topic of records rather than a specific historical topic. Now, for over 34 years, as Melanie mentioned, I worked at the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, in bureaucratic terms. Nearly all of those years with World War II American records, military records, and or captured German records. The latter are reproduced on over 70,000 microfilm rolls. The majority of my career involved preparing finding aids to these records, usually in the form of guides, with detailed descriptions of the contents of the records, so that researchers like yourselves could consult these finding aids and navigate your own way, at least in part, to identify records that were relevant to your own research. We called it wholesale research rather than retail research, helping individuals one by one. We did that too, of course. And of course, then you have the personal contact, but it's better, you can reach many more people by preparing finding aids. Now, the overwhelming interest in World War II, in Nazi Germany, and the Holocaust determined that priority in description, in the preparation of finding aids, would always be on those records, those captured records of the 30s and the 40s. First World War German records, of necessity, received less attention. But in my last career years, and in the 10 years I worked part-time as a volunteer, I tried to close that gap, and I hope I've achieved at least some of that. So today, we're going to talk about German Navy records. We'll talk about finding aids to those records and about the history that is to be found in those records, especially history that is yet to be written or which needs rewriting. Okay, this is Tambach Castle, located in northern Bavaria. The First World War German Naval Archive was moved here from Berlin as early as March 1941, as Allied bombings began. As Allied bombings increased in Berlin, beginning especially summer, autumn 1943, most of the World War II German Navy records also were transferred here for safekeeping. Allied forces captured the town of Coburg in mid-April 1945, and a British intelligence team was almost immediately on the spot to begin the examination and exploitation of the records. Now, by prior agreement, the British enjoyed priority in the exploitation of captured German Navy and Luftwaffe records, while the US had first claim on German Army and military headquarters records. The US Navy, however, very quickly established a microfilm project in London that operated from 1945 to 1947 to copy as many of the German Navy records as possible. And this included First World War records as well. Key problem was that the original German archival arrangement and designations were largely disrupted and disorganized. When the records were transferred from Coburg to London, British authorities assigned their own sequential registry numbers to the files as they were unloaded into the Admiralty buildings. Each German file received the designation, the prefix designation PG, which stood for pinched from the Germans, followed by a 5-digit number assigned sequentially as the files were unloaded from the shipping blocks. And that became the basic arrangement and the identification for individual files. When the US Navy microfilm team began filming the records in London, they had to do the filming as British authorities made them available. We were guests of the British. Therefore, we couldn't ask them to do anything they weren't comfortable with. So we had to film them as the British made them available, instead of being able to film them on a systematic planning basis. When the microfilm arrived at the Washington Navy Yard, where it remained for over 20 years, the only finding aids consisted of roll by roll lists of what was on each roll, where the titles, the German archival titles, had been roughly translated and PG numbers and date spans given for each one. That was it, no description, just translated titles, PG number, dates. And there were 3x5 paper index cards that were prepared with the exact same information. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the British returned nearly all the German records, the Navy records, and certainly all the Navy World War I records, to the Bundesarchiv, the National Archives counterpart in West Germany. And the US Navy in the early 70s transferred the microfilm to the National Archives, where, of course, we set up a brand new numbering system. All the German Navy records became part of National Archives microfilm publication T1022. Now, in Germany, the original records that were returned were then reorganized into not less than 35 record groups. The record group being, the basic unit of organization for an archives, being the records of an agency or the type of records you find continually for commands, individual warships, individual units, and so forth. So the Germans set up 35 record groups for these materials. At the National Archives, we have them all reproduced on about 1,700 microfilm rolls, which are just one part of microfilm publication T1022, which has 2,600 rolls of World War II German Navy records as well. Okay, the first guide to German Navy records of the First World War was published in 1984, and that is what you see there on the slide. U-boats and T-boats, 1914, 1918. What you see there on the cover is the commercial submarine U Deutschland, just outside Baltimore Harbor during its visit there in July 1916. The guide actually describes the contents of the first 97 rolls of T1022, which has over 4,300 microfilm rolls. So this describes 97 rolls. And this includes the war diaries of about 3/4 of all the World War I U-boats and about 1/4 of the war diaries for the torpedo boats. Now, the great advantage is the depth of description that's provided. It extends to a complete operational history for each submarine whose war diary has been filmed. So you get a lot of information for each U-boat in this guide, okay? But a quick glance reveals that the sequence of microfilm roll numbers, rolls 1 through 97, they have nothing to do with the sequence of U-boats. The first U-boat described is U-13, then U-14, then you go to U-20, and U-1 is located way back in the middle of the guide. So again, this reflects the availability of materials for filming at the time, again, rather than any systematic plan. If the National Archives had been involved in the filming at the beginning, you would have set up a logical, systematic filming. The Navy couldn't do that. They were stuck with the situation that they had. The next 3 published German Navy guides all dealt with World War II Kriegsmarine records, until we get to guide number 5, as we see here, which describes the contents of about 300 microfilm rolls, most of which pertain to pre-World War I German Navy records, as you see, going all the way back 1822. But there are 3 categories of records described here that are relevant for our discussion. First, there are the records of the Reichsmarineamt, or the Imperial Navy Office, which, under the direct leadership of Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, built up the modern German battle fleet from 1897 basically to 1912, which provoked a naval arms race with Great Britain and precipitated the Great War. The cover illustration is that of the battleship Rhineland, one of the first of the Dreadnought era class battleships commissioned in the German Navy. Now, these Navy office records document the relevant Reichstag legislation, the Navy bills that funded the building of the battle fleet, shipbuilding plans and budgets, and especially naval relations with Britain. The Germans were following how the British were reacting to this, and of course, they reacted in a way the Germans were not quite expecting. The second category of records that you see in this finding aid consists of presentations and direct meetings of senior naval leaders with the Kaiser from 1899 up through June 1918. So in this collection, you'll find the listing, the catalog of Immediatvorträge, as they were termed. For example, of Tirpitz with the Kaiser, going over building the battle fleet. When World War I begins, you have records of the meetings of the Kaiser with his senior naval commanders. Reinhard Scheer's account to the Kaiser of the Battle of Jutland, also in here. The final category in this particular finding aid concerns the reports and correspondence of German naval attachés prior to and through World War I for the attachés that were serving in neutral powers. But again, the naval attachés reports from Britain, very, very interesting for this time period, for the pre-war period leading up to 1914. Now, all these are very important, but they are not as important as the records that are described in the next guide. Okay. Here is the most important, the most comprehensive published guide to World War I German Navy records, guide number 6, selected records of the Imperial German Navy relating to World War I. Now, this was printed in 2008, and the guide describes the contents of over 850 rolls of Imperial German Navy records. So this is over half all the German Navy records for the World War I and pre-World War I period. Above all, it does 2 things. First of all, it catalogs all the remaining war diaries of German warships, German naval commands, German naval stations, flotillas, half flotillas, and so forth. It completes the listing of U-boats and torpedo boats that was begun in guide number 1, but it does not provide anything like the operational histories. We couldn't do that. We needed to just get to as many records as we could. The cover, by the way, if you're interested, some of you might recognize this photo. It's of U-53, which was one of the top scoring U-boats of World War I during its 5-hour visit to Newport, Rhode Island on October 7th, 1916. We just passed the anniversary for it. After hosting a visit by US Navy officers on board, I think one of them took this photo. The submarine then proceeded off the coast of the United States and sank 5 ships, 3 British and 2 neutral ships. However, this was all done by prize rules, so no lives were lost. Okay, but of course, the point of this visit was to leave an impression on the United States that you're not that far away. To return to what's inside the cover, guide number 6 includes the second distinctive feature of this guide in describing records: detailed descriptions of the subject correspondence files that were maintained by the 5 separate German Navy headquarters organizations during World War I. And here you see those 5 illustrated in something of an idea of the loose relationship among these 5 commands. Now, I could spend the rest of the talk just outlining the conflicts among these 5 different organizations, how this 5-headed hydra shaped the uneven, often tortured course of the German naval conduct of the Great War. But for our purpose, the key aspect here is to realize that each of these 5 headquarters organizations created its own body of records, okay, leaving history a rich source of documentation. Each headquarters particularly generated extensive central correspondence files arranged by subject or by geographic area, and they're under chronologically. These correspondence files are those precisely that have been underutilized, if not ignored, by historical research to this point, either unaware that they exist or, for the most part, deterred by the lack of intellectual access to the contents. Up until this guide was published, the only idea that you had what was in these files was central correspondence file of Admiralstab der Marine. What does that mean? What's in those records? Oh, it's several hundred microfilm rolls. Well, I'm going to go to the war diaries. That's what happened. Historians generally relied on the war diaries because there you've got a specific ship, a specific command, specific dates. You know, it's on a specific roll of film. So historians naturally gravitated toward the war diaries of German Navy warships and commands to examine the German Navy in World War I. They didn't bother with this material because there was no access to it intellectually. Now, this guide number 6, includes the descriptions of these central correspondence files. Now, as an example of what you might find in them, here we see the beginning of a personal account of a U-boat petty officer who'd been captured by the British, escaped in August 1917, and made his way back to Germany disguised as a Danish seaman, got aboard a Danish ship, and then got back to Germany via Denmark. And this report, this personal account, this exploit of a U-boat petty officer is included among a collection of materials maintained by the Imperial Navy Cabinet regarding U-Bootskrieg. That's the overarching subject matter, U-Bootskrieg, U-boat operations. The statement details his captivity, his eventual escape from a camp that was near Manchester, and his return to Germany. Also in this collection, you're going to find memoranda by Chancellor Beckman Hollweg to the Kaiser about why we can't risk unrestricted submarine warfare because of the risk of war with the United States. Elsewhere, there are reports and conversations of senior naval leaders with Hindenburg and Ludendorff regarding resuming unrestricted submarine warfare. So what you're seeing here is an example of this fascinating jumble of different perspectives within a single subject correspondence file. The Germans did not separate it out according to detailed content. They're putting all kinds of different perspectives, different command levels, all into the central correspondence files, arguably because no one had this experience before. You're creating central correspondence files for the greatest conflict of all time to this point. And so no one thinks to start segregating out files according to security level or content matter. It's just correspondence files of the Navy cabinet. So that's where this wound up. Here is another example of a personal account of a German officer's escape from Russian captivity in March of 1916. It is located among the records of the Admiralstab, the Admiralty staff. Lieutenant José Erich Killinger, whom we see a photo of here, was a naval aviator who was captured in 1916 in what is today Lithuania by the Russians, sent to a POW camp in Siberia, escaped very quickly to China, and in China embarked on a neutral ship bound for Spain, and from Spain made his way back to Germany. He was only out of action for a couple of months. By 1918, he's flying out of Zeebrugge, and he's a witness to the famous British commando raid at Zeebrugge. His account is taken from a collection of reports and correspondence that otherwise relate to internees, mostly German merchant seamen who escaped or who were repatriated back to Germany. You have to know it's in the files to see what's there. And you wouldn't know it from the title. Now, this is a typical page from guide number 6, describing the contents of several Admiralty staff files, all relating to Mediterranean operations. Each description begins with the file designation and the title. And that was one of the things I did with this guide. Bring back what was the original German file title and what the file numbers were. So you can see a sequence by which German archivists had arranged these materials originally. So you start with the original title and you close with the date span that's covered, the PG number, and the roll number. The description itself always begins with a general description of what's contained, and then specific references to individual items that are worthy of note. Now here, for example, you have interrogation reports for example, a captured British aviator who talks about loose German communications signal security among German U-boats. That could have been of some interest to the German intercept service and intelligence. You have also here statements by French and British POWs captured by the Germans, again relating to German U-boat operations. And this particular file here documents, and together with there's a number of other files that also relate to the same subject here, the Mir expedition, which involved the operations of several U-boats, gun running, weapons, ammunition, supplies, and occasionally Turkish liaison officers to the Senussi tribesmen along the coast of Libya, where the Senussi had secured control of much of the countryside against Italian colonial forces, as well as fighting against French forces to the west in Tunisia and British forces to the east in Egypt. fascinating account of Libya in World War I that I can't recall seeing much literature about, but which did involve a number of German U-boats. And this is, I would say, one of the least described aspects of the German submarine campaign in World War I. This extended from November 1916 through October 1918, the support of the Senussi tribes. No less extraordinary was German naval support for Turkish forces in Iraq, which the British always referred to as Mesopotamia at this time, which included the operations of a German river gunboat flotilla that operated on the Euphrates River, mounting guns up to 105 millimeter guns on the Euphrates against British forces. I would suggest that the overall role of the German Navy in the Mediterranean merits a new examination. Another distinctive feature of the Mediterranean included a unique effort at cooperation of U-boats with German naval aircraft operating off the Macedonian coast during the Salonika campaign. In October 1916, submarine U-33 rescued 2 downed naval aviators from an aircraft that had been operating from a seaplane base at Zante, which was then on the territory of Germany's ally, Bulgaria. That whole area was later ceded to Greece after World War I. The rescue of these aviators sparked the idea that maybe you could cooperate between the Zante-based seaplanes, like the Brandenburg aircraft you see here, and cooperate with German U-boats in attacking Allied shipping off Salonika. In fact, U-33 was again involved in the project. It departed from Istanbul and rendezvoused with a seaplane on November 17th, 1916, to try to coordinate a joint attack on Allied shipping off Salonika. They attempted the effort 3 days later. It didn't work for various reasons. This was in the Gulf of Orfano, for those of you who are interested in that area. It all miscarried due to the strength of Allied defenses, bad weather, and the technological limitations of World War I aircraft and submarines. But it provides another example of German naval improvisation and experimentation in the Mediterranean. Now, after German Navy Guide number 6 was published, 2 additional electronic finding aids were prepared to describe 2 separate but significant sets of files of naval historical materials, apparently organized by German Navy archivists in order to prepare the official histories during the post-war period. And if you're interested, some of you may be familiar with this. This is one of the volumes in the series, Der Krieg zur See, 1914-1918. Okay, this is one of, I think, 12 volumes for the North Sea operations. Well, all of these volumes were based on the historical files that were collected by German Navy archivists from the war, supplemented by some post-war materials, and collected in this numbered files of German Navy records, amounting to about 160 files altogether that were reproduced on 56 rolls. Entire collection being entitled Kriegsoperationen Nordsee. And each one of the operations is numbered, and they included airship operations as well. Here's the front page of that finding aid. And as Melanie will be able to tell you, we mounted it. It is available. You'll be able to access it yourselves if you're interested, because I provided electronic copies to Melanie earlier. This is the first page of that finding aid, and I'm going to be discussing materials directly from this material coming up. Now, in contrast to the Mediterranean, the topic of German Zeppelins has received a lot of attention, especially by British historians. Here we see the wreck of naval airship L-20 after it crash landed on the Norwegian coast, May the 3rd, 1916. L-20 had intended to attack a strategic bridge in the Firth of Forth, Scotland, but it became lost in the Scottish fog, disoriented by wind, until they finally discovered they were over a body of water. And then they realized it was Loch Ness. They didn't tarry long to look for the monster, but they beat a hasty retreat because they were very low on fuel and they were experiencing engine trouble. They headed for Norway and just made it to the coast before ditching. Crew was interned, except for some who were able to be picked up and repatriated to Germany, where the account of what had happened was recorded. Now for L-20, we have the complete war diary of its operations. Each airship has its own war diary, if you're interested. Also, among the records of the Reichsmarineamt, you have a separate set of mission reports for each sortie that an airship embarked upon. You get the technical details for each airship's mission. What was the loading? What was the ballast that it was carrying? How many bombs was it carrying? What types of bombs was it carrying? What was the planned route? What were the contingents? How many crew members did you have? What was the armament? Did you change any armament? How much fuel? And so forth. All those technical details are available in a separate set of Reichsmarineamt mission reports. So that's enough, right? No. For the context of the naval airship campaign, we need to consult the Admiralty staff subject files for air operations, as you see here. Luftunternehmungen. 11 volumes of correspondence, reports, and memoranda that cover the entire war. The level of description that you see here, this is what you get for each volume of the 11 volumes. So again, you get a general description, but above all, you get specific examples of the documents you'll find in that volume outlined here. Again, with the indication of what the date span, PG number, and roll number is. And what you get in these 11 volumes is a tremendous amount of information regarding planning of operations, targeting of specific armaments industries, plants, so forth, bridges, weapons factories, but above all, intelligence that came back to Germany about trying to evaluate the effect of these raids. And that's the most impressive thing that I learned in going through these 11 volumes and writing up these descriptions. The intelligence sources that send information back to Germany, quite extensive. You had agents who were actively working in Britain, reporting back. You had press accounts by both the British press and neutral press. You had neutral observers, including American businessmen, who would write reports and who would be interviewed and make their observations known about what was happening. When you look at those sources, they tell two completely different stories. Some of them say, oh yeah, these raids, they're tremendously effective. I saw people running away in panic and fear, and boy, they really blew up this one weapons factory. It's completely annihilated. The same sources, others would say, I don't see that they're really achieving anything. I don't see anything of significance that's really being accomplished by these raids. So I would argue that the intelligence information that is evident in these files, and again, they've mixed in intelligence in the middle of all the other kind of correspondence that relates to these operations. They don't have a separate set of intelligence files on the topic. It's all mixed in. But looking at this intelligence, how could they determine the effectiveness, the physical effectiveness, the psychological effectiveness of the raids? I would argue they couldn't. This is one of the problems why the raids continued and why they failed as much as they did, or perhaps succeeded as much as they did. For those familiar with the literature, it's obvious that Douglas Robinson's classic book, The Zeppelin in Combat, used precisely these 11 volumes when he was doing his work in the 50s and early 60s. But he never cited any individual files. It's a great book, and he does have footnotes, but he wouldn't say where the material was. Perhaps that was the condition of the agreement, that he was allowed access to it, because all those records were still in London at the time. Now, by contrast, the two most recent studies of Zeppelin attacks on London by Ian Castle and Nigel Parker use no German sources at all. And so inevitably, we come to the Battle of Jutland, the only major fleet action of the war fought on May 31st and June 1st, 1916. Forests of trees have been sacrificed to produce the vast literature on this topic, which for all of its volume remains fixed on several specific points: the tactical evolution of the battle, gunnery and ordnance aspects, the controversy between the two senior British commanders, Admiral Sir John Jellicoe and Vice Admiral Sir David Beatty, and the ultimate strategic result of the battle, most recently assessed by the National Museum of the Royal Navy in its centennial exhibition on Jutland at Portsmouth. Some of you might have been there. I was in October 2016. The exhibition titled "The Battle That Won the War." Remarkably, the battle as a human drama involving tens of thousands of men and over 8,000 men killed in 16 hours doesn't seem to provide much of a focus. The relevant German naval historical files described here, this is the first set, 6 volumes of collected records, all these 6 volumes focus on operational aspects from the German Navy point of view. War diary excerpts, after action reports, maps, annotated ship's plans that illustrate shell hits, and so forth. Fascinating operational material. A second collection, however, comprises 3 additional volumes of supporting materials. Again, it's a separate title, as you see here. Operationen unserer Flotte, Seeschlacht vor dem Skagerrak. And that was the German title, the Skagerrak Schlacht, for the Battle of Jutland. Now, these 3 volumes include a lot of intelligence documentation, including intercepts of British naval communications, which I can't recall seeing in any of the literature about the Battle of Jutland. The fact that Germans were actually intercepting some British signals. Also, press reactions to the battle among neutral powers, the recovery of survivors and of bodies by Danish and Dutch vessels, and especially, as I've marked here, extensive interrogations of captured British personnel recovered by the Germans during the battle, brought back to Germany and interrogated about their experiences. Okay, both volumes 1 and volume 2 of this secondary collection have extensive interrogations of British personnel. In fact, after the German Navy got through interrogating them, they then were interrogated by the German Army, a separate set. Okay. And again, there are 2 recent British accounts, both using the title Voices of Jutland, that make no use whatsoever of these voices of British personnel captured at Jutland. Nor, in fact, do either of these volumes contain any citations to original German Navy records relating to the Battle of Jutland. Therefore, I suggest that there's certainly room for a broader view of the Battle of Jutland with the available source materials at hand. Excuse me a minute. The Baltic theater has always been relegated to no more than secondary status. in World War I naval history. Partly, I would argue, because there's not much British naval presence there except for submarines. Germany was the only naval power that could shift naval forces from the North Sea to the Baltic and back again, according to strategic needs. The electronic format finding aid here, this is the second one, which is the counterpart to the North Sea operations, but this focuses on German operations in the Baltic, actually going up to 1919. It is a much smaller collection than the North Sea collection. It's about on 31 rolls of microfilm, whereas the North Sea operations are about 60 rolls of microfilm. The best known actions of the Germans in the Baltic are those normally associated with the lone German amphibious operation of World War I, the conquest of the three Russian-occupied islands at the head of the Gulf of Riga in October-November 1917, codenamed Operation Albion. And there is a recent book on that topic, most recently analyzed in this excellent 2008 study by Michael Barrett. And he used these sources, the sources that relate to that operation in this finding aid. Barrett used them, and congratulations and kudos to him. But beyond specific sea and air operations, the general aspect of German naval dominance of the Baltic exerted a role that I don't think has been adequately understood or even examined. When German forces occupied Riga in September 1917, they seized a variety of Russian records, among them commercial records that revealed the rapid and extensive growth in trade of the Russian Baltic ports in particular, especially St. Petersburg and Riga, during those 20 years, 1890 to 1910. A German Navy analyst pulled out this data in December 1917. That's where it's reproduced in the microfilm. And I've translated the basic points that he uncovered in these records. You can see how critically important these ports had become in the 20 years before World War I for the Russian economy, which was fast developing, I would say, in the early 20th century. This trade, of course, all but disappeared after war began. Only a fraction of it could be rerouted through Murmansk and Archangel in the north. The disruption of this commerce and its effect on the Russian economy and finances as a direct result of German naval dominance of the Baltic has not received much study. In this, the role of the German Navy in the defeat of Russia in 1917 remains almost unexamined. To me, this represents the most significant gap in World War I naval historiography right now. Now, I'll wrap up the discussion by addressing a legend that continues to be repeated about the North Sea operations in World War I. I'd be surprised if anyone here has not heard the statement that after Jutland, the German fleet never left port again. Sometimes it's more subtly expressed as the German fleet never again challenged the British fleet in the North Sea. Let's look at some facts. Here's the title sheet for a post-war assessment of the High Seas Fleet, that's the German High Seas Fleet, operation of August 19th, 1916, 2.5 months after Jutland. As the documents in this study, and of course in the original files indicate, Admiral Reinhard Scheer had the exact same mission and task as at Jutland, now in August, to try to catch a portion of the British fleet's capital ships at advantage to the Germans. But this time he has a much weaker fleet than at Jutland. As we see here, the German fleet came out pretty far. They came out into the central North Sea. This is just as far, if not farther, than they came than for the Battle of Jutland, which is approximately here. In this case, they went out to the central North Sea. The British fleet sortied to meet them. Another fleet engagement seemed imminent when Fleet Admiral Scheer received intelligence, which would prove to be erroneous, that an approaching British force from the south included some capital ships. So Scheer diverted to the south to meet them. Hopefully, this would be the ideal situation, catching a small part of British capital ships with an overwhelming force. But by veering south, he just missed engaging the main British fleet. And that likely would have resulted in a German defeat, very possibly much worse than a German defeat. Later, Scheer learns that there are no capital ships heading north. He realizes it's been a waste of time and he heads back to port. The High Seas Fleet came out again, October 18th to the 20th, 1916, as we see here, again in the same general area. The mission this time had changed to try to disrupt merchant shipping that was operating in the central North Sea area. The operation ended with bad weather and German signal intelligence that indicated the British knew about the German fleet sortie and Allied shipping had been diverted. So again, no point. Still another fleet operation was planned for the period immediately after December 10th, 1916, as revealed here in Admiral Scheer's war diary. See, this entire passage is by Scheer talking about the planned sortie. A fleet thrust to the north was anticipated, similar to that as for the Jutland operation. In this passage, Scheer records his objections to the operation, which he identifies as incorrect, unrichtig, the last word. He considers the operation faulty, flawed, because A is going to be without 3 of his capital ships for the operation, and because he expects that with the change in British Admiralty from Admiral Jellicoe to Admiral Beatty, now in command of the British Grand Fleet, that you're likely to see more offensive actions by the British, and you need to be more prepared in a defensive capacity than for offensive. In fact, Beatty's taking over did not indicate a change in British strategy. That's a separate story. But what's also interesting about this passage is that it confirms rather clearly that it's the German Admiralty staff that is directing strategy, not Admiral Scheer, a point that doesn't emerge from Scheer's memoirs. It's always left kind of as a collaborative effort, but in fact, it's the Admiralty staff that is directing these operations. And again, something that a lot of English-speaking historians have not considered, this tension between different German command levels about what strategy and policy is going to be, what it's going to be. In the end, the very bad weather, not surprisingly, in December, forced the cancellation of the planned operation. In 1917, significant portions of the fleet transferred to the Baltic, as I've mentioned, and the return to unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1st preoccupied the use of the High Seas Fleet's light forces in minesweeping and support activities. But that still did not mark the end of German fleet North Sea operations. What we see here is an annotated High Seas Fleet operational map from the period indicating the German fleet sortie of April 23rd to the 24th, 1918, an abortive attempt to intercept the Norwegian convoys that were operating along this route from Bergen to the Firth of Forth. Okay. Earlier in 1917, 2 German cruisers had managed to get up there, intercept one of those convoys, and destroy it. Sank 2 destroyers and 8 of the 10 merchant ships. And so the Scheer decided that would be a good operation to do with the entire fleet because the convoys were now larger with more escorts. So Scheer sortied and using radio silence, okay, British naval intelligence did not pick up on this movement by the German high seas fleet. As we see here, the scouting group, which included the battle cruisers, they're north of the Orkney Islands. I'd say they came out of port. And the main body of the fleet, German fleet, is off Stavanger, okay, in Norway. British fleet's here. German fleet's here. Interesting, huh? That's over 400 miles. They've come almost twice as far as they did for the Battle of Jutland. However, once again, the High Seas Fleet is betrayed by poor intelligence. They had incorrect information regarding the departure dates of the convoys from the Firth of Forth and Bergen. And they were 1 day behind a 34-ship merchant convoy that was escorted by 4 battle cruisers and light surface forces. That would have been an interesting surprise and an interesting engagement. In the end, nothing happened. Scheer is able to get back to port. That's an interesting story in itself, considering the position of the British fleet. German fleet is able to get back untouched. They do have 1 battle cruiser that suffers severe damage from an internal engine problem, and the ship has to be towed much of the way home, but they still make it back without contact from the British fleet. So in any case, you cannot say that the German fleet refused to come out into the North Sea after the Battle of Jutland. Now, just in conclusion, I'll recap some of the comments I made just as we were getting started. Right now, what's the situation at the National Archives? Well, the pandemic, of course, has devastated. Most of the people who work at the archives, they're still at home. They don't come into work. There's a skeleton staff in the main building and in the archives too. As I understand it, any researcher who wants to use records there has to make an appointment ahead of time and can spend no more than 4 hours at the archives. The long-term schedule is to to digitize everything. That's billions and billions, not of stars, but of pages that need to be digitized, including all the microfilm. I asked, and as of this date, they can't even begin to think of what date they will begin to digitize German microfilm, much less German Navy microfilm. But the finding aids, the 2 electronic format finding aids I've mentioned, they are available to you now, thanks to Melanie putting these things up. And the other guides that I mentioned that are referenced, these are the original copies of the guides that I mentioned. These are available on the National Archives website, which you can access by going to www.nara.gov. That'll take you to them. But you still have to navigate your way through that website to get to them. And then you have to allow time to download them. If you click on them, be prepared to be patient because it'll take a while to download them. With that, I'm ready for questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tim. Let me get myself reset up here. And Tim, if you don't mind, we'll move back to gallery view.
Okay, good, fine.
And so we'll give Tim a second to stop the screen share.
Okay.
All right, great. Wow, I have learned a lot in this hour. All right, so let me just consolidate my windows a little bit here. I think you're all on you're on 2 screens. So I'll kind of move back and forth just to see if anybody wants to get in, but please just speak up. Please, no need to raise your hand, or you're free to unmute yourself and speak up, especially if you don't have video on, because if you don't have your video on, I can't see if you're raising your hand or anything like that. So just go ahead and speak up. You can also put a question in the chat if you like, and I can ask it on your behalf to Tim. So Tim and everyone, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm open.
So Tim, we do have a question from Tom, who gives you some bravo Zulu, some congratulations there. And he asks if there are any medical annexes in these records that you have been discussing.
Unfortunately, no. And this is one of the sacrifices that the US Navy had to make in the microfilming project back in the 1945 to 47. Their focus was on operational documentation. They chose not to try to microfilm personnel and administrative files. The British had them. It's possible the British microfilmed more of those personnel files and have them available. The originals would certainly be available in the Bundesarchiv, which is still the military archive, which is still in Freiburg, Germany. So that would be the place to go. On the whole, there's not a lot of information, except where they could work it into the central subject correspondence files. I don't recall seeing much of anything in that way, but an example of what you would find, they would, in staff conferences, they would talk about personnel turnover and officer turnover. You would disband certain units, disband certain ships, decommission them, and recycle the personnel and the officers for the U-boat service and expanded light surface forces. But unfortunately, no, not much in our microfilm collections about medical situation.
Thanks, Tim. I think we have another question coming up in the chat. Yes, from Jacqueline or Jacqueline.
Jackie, yes.
Does NARA have records of the German army of World War I?
You'd be surprised how many records we actually do have of the German army in World War I. First of all, there was a collection, there was a specific effort by the US War Department in the 1920s through the 1930s of contacting German archives authorities, which were military guys, to get transcripts of original German army records relating to German units that fought against American units, as well as material that was of historical interest, including Eastern Front operations. Those records are very well described. They're in record group 165 at the National Archives in College Park. Several hundred boxes worth of transcribed German army records. Secondly, there's a significant collection of original German documents seized on the battlefield by American forces, 1917, 1918. And they were all forwarded to AEF G2 section and maintained by that section. So among the records of the AEF G2, you have a large amount of original German records. Many of them are not that interesting. They're more administrative. They're literally battlefield sweepings. Once you occupied a German trench, you went into one of the bunkers and grabbed whatever you found there. So a lot of it is very, very local level, tactical level, and company and regimental level, but still very useful. And then finally, there are a few German original records that were microfilmed with German army records from later. For example, the German army in the 1930s went back and studied World War I operations, and they would incorporate World War I records in their studies from the 30s and 40s. So that's a third way of getting at German army records at the National Archives.
Thanks, Tim. We have a question from Jim asking if the NARA has any records from other Central Powers.
About other Central Powers, I don't believe so, except for maps. In the cartographic section, which is a kind of a separate entity at the National Archives, there are captured maps of World War I. And again, most of these are German army maps And I think there may be some Austro-Hungarian maps mixed in with them. I'm not quite sure how we got those, but the cartographic collection is kind of a world unto itself, as all the special archives divisions are. So there may be some there, but for the most part, no, we do not have Austro-Hungarian, Turkish records, except where you have them incorporated with other German records, including, for example, German Navy records for the Mediterranean, German Navy records for cooperation with Turks. You do get a lot of information from Turkish authorities and from the Austro-Hungarians about the operation of German U-boats in the Adriatic and the Mediterranean, for example. German U-boats for a while had to disguise themselves as Austro-Hungarians in 1915, because for a period, Italy was at war with Austria-Hungary, but not at war with Germany. So the Austro-Hungarians asked, well, can you help us out with that? So the Germans agreed, okay, we'll run up German flags, we'll run up Austro-Hungarian flags and pretend that we're Austro-Hungarian U-boats, but they were always German U-boats. It was kind of funky. That's an interesting sub-story of the Mediterranean operations.
Thanks, Tim. Another question, still on this broad theme from Scott. Do you know whether Canada also maintains German naval records? And if so, would they be kept in Ottawa?
That's an interesting question. I suspect they might, but I suspect that what's more likely is that they have copies of Royal Navy records relating to fighting the Germans, which incorporate a lot of intelligence and maybe translations of German documents from the war period. And I think the Canadians probably received from the British some copies of what the British had. But for the most part, we have no idea what the British microfilmed of the World War I German records that were in their custody for 20 years after World War II. We know they filmed some German Navy records from World War I because I've seen copies of their finding aids, which they provided duplicates to us, to the National Archives, to the Navy, that is, and then to us. But what the British actually, did they still hold some US Navy records, some German Navy records? Were some shared with the Canadians? You'd have to check. It's worth checking with the Canadian Archives, but I suspect there are more of these Royal Navy translations of German Navy records rather than original German records themselves, but it's possible.
Thanks. I have a question from Ayan. I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name. Do you know whether records related to the Gallipoli campaign and the Ottoman-German alliance exist in this collection that you've been speaking about?
Extensive documentation of German Navy support for the Dardanelles operation from the Turkish point of view. A great deal of this direct support, such as Navy coastal batteries in the Dardanelles. They were all German Navy operations. German U-boats proceeded to operate in that area. It was a U-boat from Istanbul that was operating against Allied forces in the Salonika campaign. You had the two German, the battle cruiser Goeben and the light cruisers that were given to the Turks at the beginning. Well, they became Turkish ships, but they still had German crews on board, flying the Turkish flag. Admiral Souchon, I think, was the very unusual German name, but they had a lot of German names that were unusual in World War I. Admiral Souchon operated many of these commands, and there's extensive documentation in the German Navy records reproduced as part of T1022 that relate to these close cooperation with Turkish forces in the Dardanelles, but only for naval aspects. You're not going to find much about, fighting Australian and New Zealander troops as they came ashore, or fighting in the trenches at Gallipoli. It's going to be a more strategic level.
Thanks, Tim. I have a question. You talked about the lack of citation of these German sources in various books and other research. Why do you think that is? Was it lack of awareness? What are your ideas about the reason that these sources weren't consulted, or at least they weren't cited?
It's an interesting question. I think there's been a generational change of perspective. I'm reading this. This is my interpretation. When you look at the work done by Douglas Robinson, who did the book on the Zeppelins, extensive work on German research, finding out what's there. Barrett doing his book on Operation Albion. Going back to Corelli Barnett, his writings on the First World War. You see a reliance on German sources. With the new generation of British historians, Peter Hart comes to mind. There's just not that much interest in what the Germans have to say. It seems to be an indifference to German source material. It may be not just that, maybe that might not be confined to the British. There's a recent book about German U-boat operations off the New England coast. And it was a rather small book, but the author never even bothered to look at the war diary of the U-boats that were involved. He just relied entirely on US Navy sources. I don't know, but it seems to me that an earlier generation was more committed to examining both sides of the conflict in order to come up with adequate history. And there doesn't seem to be quite that interest at present among many younger historians.
May I comment on that?
Please.
Doug Robinson, who wrote The Zeppelin in Combat and used all of these German sources, was American, not British.
Okay.
He was a physician living in New Jersey. I went to a World War I aviation conference in the early 90s, and there was a speaker making a comparison between US journal publications and British journal publications on World War I aviation. And he said, the British only write about themselves. There was a lot more diversity of topics in the American World War I aviation journals than there was in the British journal, and I think that's still true. So there's some tendency, I think, on the part of the British to focus on their own experience. They'll write a lot about the Zeppelin attacks on England, and much of it will be from their perspective, what happened on the ground there. And I don't want to overstate that, but that's sort of the general tendency.
I certainly would agree with that. Thanks for informing me about Robinson. But he had to have gone to London, or either that, or I mean, he might have used the microfilm here. He didn't exactly cite where he used that material. And again, he would give footnotes. He gives very good footnotes, but he doesn't cite the files that he used. And again, here's the thing that always struck me. Those original German records sat in London for over 20 years. So anyone who had the official approval could go in and leaf through the originals. They didn't have to squint at a microfilm reader. They didn't have to rely on a copier to try to produce legible copies from a microfilm machine. They could use the originals, do copying. I don't see the results of that kind of research. And again, the two recent books on the Zeppelin attacks, there are no German sources cited. And the two recent books, Voices of Jutland, they're British voices, they're not German voices. But they don't even use the German sources that record British voices from the Battle of Jutland.
Doug Robinson, I'm sorry. Doug Robinson did extensive research in Germany.
Okay.
He interviewed the widow of one of the German Zeppelin
That's right.
crewmen. Actually, he was a Zeppelin commander. and he was the most famous one, Heinrich Matty.
Yeah.
And Matty's widow lived into, I think it was the 1990s. And so he interviewed her extensively. So he went all over the place, and he went to reunions of Zeppelin crews from World War I. So he did go all over the place in search of information, which is why his book is just, it still stands alone.
Yes, it does. Absolutely.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Tim. We should wrap it up here. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thanks for all your questions. Of course, thanks, Tim, for all your time and expertise. We will have our next meeting the second Saturday in November, which, sorry, I need to look at my calendar here for that exact date, the 13th, November 13th. And as always, we'll send out announcements about that. I know that Sal is looking for speakers for the later fall and winter. I've put my email address here in the chat. So if you are interested in being a speaker, please email me. Also, just a reminder about the chat. Let me just paste these again real quick. I did put the finding aids that
Thank you.
that Tim had. Oops, I I forgot. You cannot copy from the chat. So if you, I'll give the chat will still be up for another minute here. So if you scroll up, you can see those links to the finding aids that Tim mentioned. The links are also in the meeting reminder that I sent out. They should have gotten this morning, and I will see if I can include links to them in the on the YouTube channel. I'm not sure if I can do that, but I'll check it out and see if that's possible. You can also, of course, email me if you need the links again. And thanks to everyone. And we're starting our new membership year, so a couple membership renewals have started to come in for this for the next year. Thank you so much. I'll be processing those. If you did already send in your renewal, thank you. If you didn't send in your renewal yet, you'll be hearing from Randy and others soon. You can do this online, is the easiest way. If you go to the, oops, sorry, let me change my focus, change my chat here. If you go to the organization's website and there's a renewal tab, the issue 15, the current issue of the magazine, has been mailed out. You may have received it already. I think that depends on where you are. And I'm also ready to send out the PDF. I just got that from our editor, Ed. If you are a PDF subscriber, look for that early this coming week. Thanks again to Tim. That was fascinating. I learned a great deal of topics that I never thought about before, and really appreciated the opportunity to learn.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Go ahead, Tim. Anything else you wanted to say before we head out?
Have a good day.
All
Enjoy the fall. Enjoy the autumn.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.